So, as just has been said there, and you've probably seen from my biography, Mark White, I've worked in cross-government, working on fragile and conflict-affected states for the best part of about 15 years now, in the MOD, in DFID, in the Foreign Office, and in the Stabilisation Unit. So, depending on how generous you're feeling today, either I'm a seamless cross-Whitehall operator or HMG's littlest hobo, just moving on from challenge to challenge as we see fit. I'm speaking today in my capacity as the Deputy Head of the Joint Secretariat, which is responsible for the NSC's Conflict, Stability and Security Fund. I think as many of you will be aware and have read, this is, and I quote, a new NSC-led approach to HMG effort in fragile and conflict-affected states, which puts greater emphasis on single cross-government strategies, greater NSC direction, greater coherence between conflict prevention and national security work, and less bureaucracy. So I think it's fair to say, to paraphrase Trotsky, which I suspect doesn't happen in this room very often, that whilst you may not be interested in it, it is certainly very interested in you. And my role today really is not to talk about the fund itself, but some of the current and future opportunities it has the potential to provide. And I think potential is the key word there for persistent engagement for the Army and for the wider military, and how some of those opportunities might be better integrated with the other levers of national power. This is not going to be without its challenges, however, and I'll touch upon those as well. And I think, given that as many of you who've worked in this space will probably appreciate that often half of the battle, as was I think slightly alluded to there, is often within HMG as opposed to within the environments that we seek to shape and influence. I'm going to deliberately take quite a broad interpretation of persistent engagement, because I think actually that persistent engagement is as important in Whitehall as it is in some of the theatres in which we seek to work. So in terms of opportunities, I think there's probably four broad areas that I can see the Army in particular playing an increasingly important role in support of HMG's wider defence, conflict, stability and security activity. And I think this can be summarised as inform, I think engage and influence, deliver and promote. You'll notice there's some vowels in there, because one of the things I think the CSSF is desperately short of at the moment is vowels, which you'll find when you try and pronounce it in any questions that you come up to ask me. First one then is inform, and I think this has just been touched upon by the previous speaker. Often, I think the NSC in particular, given its timeframes for activity and its need to be seen to be responding instantly, doesn't take as much or place as much emphasis on this as it could. And I think the Army in particular, via its footprint and via some of the extensive lessons architecture that it has an important and I think increasingly influential role to play both in Whitehall and in country in informing HMG's wider contextual analysis. That in part, I think, is through a mechanism that's becoming increasingly popular for Foreign Office, DFID, MOD and the Home Office, the Joint Analysis of Conflict and Stability Framework, but more importantly, and I think more informally as well, using the vast network of contacts, networks, information that the military have at its disposal to influence those processes. Often the people who engage in those processes from the MOD may not necessarily have that richness of influence at their fingertips, and it's quite important to ensure that the right bits of the system dock in. I think equally, and this was alluded to by the previous speaker, I think there's a very valuable role that can be played in better integrating those JAX processes that often inform HMG's overarching strategies with the military planning process, and making sure that if we are all aligned in Whitehall or in a COBRA via the NSC, is that we then don't start breaking down into separate pillars once we move into that operational space. And I think equally the Defence Attaché network, as I'll go on to talk about, with sufficient investment in it, can contribute to the continued monitoring of environments. We don't just see this analysis as a one-off snapshot and then operate off previous analysis that often can be a couple of years old, but actually is contributing to the delivery of NSC programming and activity in real time. Second area then is one of influence, and the NSC strategies in particular. I think one of the opportunities that is there for all departments now, but the MOD in particular, that probably has only had limited influence so far, has been how the Army and how the MOD more widely influence not only the pillars of those NSC strategies that directly impact upon defence engagement activity, but also offers wider thoughts on the level of ambition that's outlined in other areas of work, such as security sector reform, the promotion of rule of law, peacekeeping, countering violent extremism, just to name but a few. I think there is, to follow the integrated approach that the NSC wants to its natural conclusion, that integration shouldn't just take place at that strategic level in defining the overarching objective, but also through those various sector-specific pillars that underpin it. It's only really then that we'll move from effectively a toolkit approach to something more akin to a Swiss Army knife, where the same tool can be used for multiple purposes depending on the context. And there's a real element of speaking truth unto power there. Certainly some of the things that I've seen in terms of those NSC strategies is that the level of ambition that's set for an SSR process or the promotion of rule of law is far in excess of the ability to deliver in that particular environment. And I think making sure that there is that element of hard-nosed realpolitik, often by people who've worked on the ground, have served in those particular theatres and actually know some of the key personalities involved, could really make sure that we don't end up setting ourselves up for failure before we've even started. The third area is in and around deliver, and that's through activity funded either through the MOD or through wider CSSF resources. This clearly includes the standard defence engagement activity, of which you're all familiar, but also I think creating more of a market for what I'd describe as enhanced defence engagement designed to promote more political and developmental outcomes. We've already seen in recent months the role of the military in supporting the response to Ebola, the Mediterranean migration, search and rescue operations. And there's going to be a real need, I think, to try and ensure that when different bits of HMG are considering their delivery options, they have a far better understanding of what they can and can't access through the defence network. It strikes me, for example, from a lot of the areas I've worked in sub-Saharan Africa, of the disconnect between often large DFID-funded security sector reform programs and then the DA network and footprint. Often there will be places where DFID is spending huge amounts of money on SSR processes where there is no DA. And I think given obviously the unique relationship that defence attachés will often have in those environments, that's something that relatively easily could be corrected if HMG was making collective decisions on those footprints. And also linking, I think, clearly the defence education and the influence that it generates to the wider UK security and justice activity as an area as well. I think it's also probably would be remiss in the deliver area to look beyond bilateral activity. I think it's quite striking, obviously, that if we look at where we are in the multilateral space at the moment, one of the consequences of the Afghanistan and Iraq operations is that we've moved from being in the top 10 in terms of peacekeeping contributions within the UN down to something further nudging the late 40s, early 50s mark. But similarly, I think there are real opportunities within the EU, within NATO, within the UN and within the OSCE that we could avail ourselves of. And if there was going to be that speculate to accumulate approach that we're advocating for defence engagement, creating that cadre of people that can deliver not only for the UK but through the multilateral system will be important as well. And the final area in terms of the opportunities is promote, and I think that's the integrated approach in reality. I think one of the things that is the envy, I think, of many other departments across Whitehall is the access to training opportunities, learning opportunities and development opportunities that the military have. I think now, given that there is certainly will within the Foreign Office through the Diplomatic Academy to create a similar emphasis on institutional and specialised thematic learning. A bit more strategic partnership between the Defence Academy already has that footprint and already has a substantial investment, and the Foreign Office bringing that incentives of its own brand and encouraging its staff to avail themselves of those opportunities would be a good marriage that would deliver not only more effective people, but would send a sign up to the politicians that integrated working is delivering in practice. So now just in terms of some of the challenges, and I'll split these into two sections. I think there are some that are structural, which none of us can really do very much about at the moment, and some of them are a bit more organisational and cultural, where I think we can. The structural challenges, the first one is obvious, money. I think one of the real challenges that we have within the CSSF is, although it's £1 billion, it's £1 billion strong, it's the wrong type of money, to use the network rail excuse. The access to non-ODA, so money that is not counted as official development assistance, is highly limited. And there is a real strategic challenge, which is one that we continue to emphasise, between having a fund that's designed to deliver political imperative that's constrained by its objectives and its delivery being shaped by a classification of what is ODA and what isn't, rather than what it is needs to be done, and then to worry about the classification afterwards. It strikes me as a classic case of the tail wagging the dog. But I think to continue to push this and to argue to our political masters the need for flexible resources that don't sit within that ODA space is going to be key if we're to deliver against their objectives in places like Tunisia, the Mediterranean and beyond. Linked to that, though, ODA interpretation is also a challenge. I think for a long time, without getting too technical about it, official development assistance and DFID have been synonymous. They have been one and the same thing. and therefore actually distinguishing between what was counted as official development assistance and what DFID could do wasn't a debate that was held in within the UK system, because DFID had the monopoly on both. But now, I think through the CSSF, there's an increasing trend of a number of departments, the Foreign Office, the Home Office, the National Crime Agency, the MOD and others, delivering through the CSSF. There's a real need, I think, to recognise that in areas where the intent is benevolent and the beneficiary fits within ODA guidelines, we don't focus excessively on the provider of the assistance. It's frankly ridiculous that Lieutenant Colonel Bloggs can deliver a presentation on security sector accountability through the military on a Friday, and that would be counted as non-ODA. On a Monday morning, having retired over the weekend, he could do exactly the same thing through a private company. It would be counted as ODA-able. This is one of the major constraints, I think, to the UK defence engagement being delivered through our own army and wider services, and that's something that we need to think through. And then the last thing I think is going to be in and around the SDSR process. Clearly, there are very big decisions that need to be made in the context of the SDSR. Will defence engagement become a core task? And if so, will it be funded from the MOD core budget? Regardless of the outcome of that, will be decisions that will be made by people at a far higher pay grade than me. I think one of the things that will be important is, regardless of where the money lies, the ability for the rest of HMG to be able to articulate and inform the demand and the capability will be critical. So now, in terms of, just to conclude, some of the institutional and cultural challenges, I think one of the first ones, and probably the one that is of critical concern to the rest of Whitehall, is trying to avoid a situation of mission creep. I think the comment that was made in the earlier presentation was well made about, I think, having a lot of, whilst being clear about one's strategic objective, giving a lot of flexibility to the people on the ground. I thoroughly support that as having been someone on the end of that 3,000-mile screwdriver in the past. But I think one of the things that is going to be really important, particularly as we deliver through training teams, support teams, etc., is going to be the need to ensure that people are assessed on their ability to deliver against those cross-HMG objectives and are incentivised to do so, rather than more parochially being judged upon how much money and how many people they are responsible for. This is a problem across the whole of HMG. This is certainly not just a problem within the military. But we really need to make sure that this work is demand-driven rather than supply-driven, and that whilst there are clearly benefits through engaging in terms of people's development, their leadership and the cultural opportunities it exposes them to, we need to play this cleverly and recognise that they need to be secondary objectives in terms of the articulation of the delivery, not necessarily the primary one. Second issue, I think, is making sure that the capability is complementary to other sources of expertise, both within HMG and outside of HMG. Again, I think one of the concerns that the rest of HMG has in terms of this space is whether the military will create a massive network of people that are capable of delivering everything and having significant amounts of contingency built in there, rather than something that's small, sleek, high value, and focuses only on the areas in which the military have the comparative advantage. There is huge amounts of expertise, both within HMG, in a range of the areas that we tend to engage in fragile states, but also outside of HMG. And I think disaggregating between what it is that needs to be done, what it is that the military have a comparative advantage in, and then how to set up those networks to access the anthropological, the cultural, the political expertise required is going to be key to developing this in a way that's effective and doesn't frighten the horses. And I think making sure that the staff who are involved in this are well briefed upon what the Foreign Office can and can't do, what DFID can and can't do, what the Home Office can and can't do, and where their expertise lies will be critical. And the final issue to highlight is clearly that the time and effort that's going to be invested in doing this properly is going to be significant. I think when we hark back to the last SDSR and we look at some of the strategic threats, none of the things that have happened over the last 4 or 5 years were particularly prominent. And I think that given that we live in this area of uncertainty, in which there isn't that financial luxury to build in contingencies for everything, means that area of focus that was talked about earlier is going to be quite important. The idea of focusing on small levels of high value-added expertise doesn't sit naturally within any organisation that sits within government that tends to be generalist in nature, and it doesn't sit well with the staffing models and the structures within either HMG or the military. But there is a real need, I think, to speculate, to accumulate, to invest in developing those relationships and footprints in some of the countries we know that will be important over the next decade or so, and to try and ensure that actually, wherever possible, that investment in that understanding and expertise can be subsidised by people doing things that are operationally useful in those environments, either for HMG or for the countries of concern. So I think in conclusion, really, there is going to be a need to be humble, first and foremost. I think to start small, to be focused, probably to under-promise and over-deliver in terms of the NSC engagement, and to see this as a venture capital activity, which I know doesn't sit nicely in the current environment, but I think that's what it's going to be. I think the rest of HMG want the help, but they are worried about the scale of supply, and they will need to see delivery in order to have confidence that their investments will reap dividends. But I think in adopting an approach that aligns that military support across the entire programme cycle from analysis, from strategy to delivery, through to lessons, and then back through to analysis again, will ensure that people get comfortable with the approach, as well as showing that the impact that we all seek can be achieved. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.